everyone, it's Kelvin and welcome back to another watercolor tutorial for Procreate. So in today's video, I'm going to show you how to paint this cute little cheesecake illustration. And I think a lot of the techniques we'll cover in this video are probably useful for desserts in general. And all of this is also going to be very beginner friendly. So I've already got the Forster watercolor paper loaded into Procreate. And for the brushes, I'm going to be using the brushes in the regular watercolor kit. And as usual, I'll put links to everything I use down in the description below, including the exact sketch here, so you can follow along with me. So I've placed the sketch in here as the very top layer, and then I set the transparency mode to multiply. Then I'm going to select a blank layer underneath the paper texture, and this is where we're going to start painting. So what I'm going to do first is fill out a background wash, and I like to do it in the lightest color in the whole illustration, so in this case it's the actual cheesecake itself. So I'm going to grab the abstract round brush, a kind of warm light beige tone, and I'm going to just fill out everything here, but I am going to avoid the side of the cheesecake, and I'll explain why later on. Now the side of the cheesecake, I could just fill it in, but it would be a little bit boring, and I see it as an opportunity to add an interesting texture. So using the same abstract round, same color, I'm just going to do a bunch of lines kind of back and forth. And I'm kind of varying the pressure just to make it more interesting. And it's a pretty subtle effect, but I think it does add a nice touch to this illustration. Next, I'm going to grab the water blender brush. And at a pretty large size, I guess, I'm just going to carefully tap this around. I don't want to get rid of that texture by making it too smooth, but I am going to try to break it up in a few areas. Next, I'm going to grab the eraser brush, and I'm going to set that to the fine liner pen. And at a pretty small size, I'm just going to erase around the edge of this and just follow the sketch as best as I can. Next, I need to remove all this excess watercolor, and I could just erase it manually, but to save time, I'm going to use my usual selection trick. So I'm going to grab the selection tool, set it to automatic. I'm going to click and drag on the cheesecake, and just set it to a point where everything is selected except what I don't want. Then I'm going to go down here to invert, flip that selection around. Now I can open the layers panel and tap on this layer and click clear, and it will just clear everything that I hadn't selected. And this is just a time-saving trick because it can take a long time to go in there with the eraser. I know using the selection tool this way can be a little bit confusing, so if it doesn't make sense, just skip back 10 or 20 seconds and watch it again. I think once you see it a few times and try it yourself, it'll make sense what's going on. Next, I'm going to start adding some values to the background wash here. And what I mean is different parts here have different levels of brightness. So I'm going to use the selection tool, set to freehand, and I'm going to use the top of the cake here as an example. And I'll just select along the top, circle back, hue, saturation, and brightness, and I'll brighten it because I'm assuming the top here is getting a little bit more light. Now for the plate, a similar thing is happening, but also the plate is a different color. So I'm going to use the freehand selection tool again and isolate the plate. Then again, hue, saturation, and brightness. And I'll brighten it. And I'm also going to desaturate it, and that'll make it a little bit grayer. Now the bottom of the plate has a little bit of a shadow, so I'll isolate that one and darken it. And normally I would also darken the crust as well, but I'm just going to paint it directly on another layer, so there's no need to do that here. Now just to finish up the background wash, I recommend giving it a little bit of a color variation. So I'm going to grab the selection tool again, it's still set to freehand, and I'll just make an interesting shape in there. I'll feather it out quite a bit, hue, saturation, and brightness, and I'll just shift the hue and maybe drop in a little bit of magenta in there. And this is just to prevent the side of the cake from looking too uniform and boring. And now we can move on to the crust. So I'm going to do that on another layer. So I'll make a new layer above the background wash. I'll select a pretty saturated brown color, medium brown like this. I'm going to use the abstract round, smaller size than we did before. And I'm going to fill out the crust here, kind of dabbing the brush a lot. And I'm doing that because I want it to be kind of lumpy. And if the color of the crust doesn't look right, it might be because it's slightly too greenish or slightly too gray. It's really important that the colors here are warm and saturated, otherwise it doesn't look like a fresh kind of delicious thing. Next, I'm going to move on and add some texture to this crust. So for the brush here, I'm going to change it to the mist brush. I'm going to use it at a really large size, maybe like 50 or 60%. And I'll start with a lighter version of the same brown color we used for the crust, and watch what happens when I tap around. So it's giving a texture, right? But the texture is way beyond the edges of the crust. So there's a trick I want to show you. Now here's the crust. If I set it to alpha lock, and then I use that same brush, same color, you can see it does the same thing, but it's not going beyond the edges of the crust. So I'm just going to carefully tap around, maybe change the color a couple times, and I'm going to add a bunch of random texture. It's just important that I don't accidentally add gray colors again. Just like what I mentioned before, when the crust looks gray, it just doesn't look fresh. So try to stick with some saturated tones. I think that's enough texture. I did try to make the bottom here slightly darker than the sides or the top. Now to give this a little bit more realistic shading, I am going to brighten the top. So I'll use the freehand selection tool and just circle that. Hue, saturation, and brightness, and I'll just brighten that a little bit. And that just makes it look a little bit more three-dimensional. Next, I can move on and do the toppings here. And this is really easy. I'm just going to make sure it's on its own layer above everything. And I'm also going to lower the opacity of the sketch so it's harder for me to see it. There we go. For the brush, I'm going to use the abstract round again. And I'll choose a kind of purpley color for the blueberries. I think something like that's pretty good. And I'll roughly fill this out. And this is sort of like the background wash, so it doesn't need to be perfect. After that, I'm going to go over it again in the same color and just do some circles. And then I'll change the color a few times just so there's a variety of shades in there. And if you want to, you can add a few more berries that kind of rolled away. And these are all supposed to be very kind of transparent and glossy. So this isn't a perfect technique, but I think it's good enough for this. It's pretty simple. First, I'm going to go over it with a very dark version of that purpley blue color. And I'll use it like a shadow and just do these kind of C shapes randomly. Then I'm going to choose a slightly lighter version of that and do a couple more. And then the final pass here, I'm going to select pure white and do another set of C's, but it's going to be on the opposite side of the shadows. And if you want to, you can also go in there and add a couple of dots, just like kind of reflecting lights. And I think what I learned about painting food is it's really important that everything is bright and glossy and saturated. Otherwise it looks kind of old or something like that. I'm still figuring it out, but having the fruit being shiny seems to be a really critical thing to making this look appetizing. Now, if you want to, you can have some of the kind of blueberry jam sort of dripping down the side. And this is really easy to do, but I recommend doing it on a different layer than the berries. So I'm going to make a new layer. I'm going to do a long press here and grab that purple color again. I'll use the same abstract round, and I'll just sort of sketch out a rough pool here. And then along the side, I'll do some kind of drips going down. Now it makes sense that the top here is brighter than the side, again because the lighting is coming from the top. So I'll just darken the side with the selection tool. So I'll just select it like that, feather it out a little bit, hue, saturation, and brightness, and I'll darken it. Now where the drips are pooling down here, these should be a little bit brighter. So again, I'll select those, feather it out, hue, saturation, and brightness, and I'll just brighten it. Now it still looks a little bit too dark, and that's because the brown is showing through. So what I recommend doing is selecting the crust layer here, and then I'm going to grab the eraser brush, and I'll carefully kind of erase a space to accommodate the drips. And it's okay if I go beyond the edges a little bit, because it just adds character. And because digital watercolor can look a little bit too consistent, I like to add color variation wherever I can. So I see an opportunity here with the berries and the drips. So here are those layers. Here's the drips, here's the berries. I'm happy with the way they're painted, so I'll just merge them together. And to add the color variation, I'm going to use the freehand selection tool. And I'll just make a random selection like this. Circle it back. I'll feather it out quite a bit. hue, saturation, and brightness. I'll shift the hue here towards a more blue tone. I'll brighten it a little bit and then desaturate it. And again, it just makes this look a little bit more natural. And this one is almost done. I'm just going to do the kind of mint leaves here real quick. So I'll make a new layer. I'll select a kind of minty green color. I'm going to use the fine liner pen brush this time. And I'll just carefully rough those out. And to make these look a little more interesting, I'll add a little bit of shading. So again, I'll use the freehand selection tool. And I'll just select one side of each leaf. I'll feather it out a tiny bit. Hue, saturation, and brightness. And I'll just darken it. And now we can finish this up with the outlines. So I'll turn off the sketch. I don't need it anymore. And all the outlines will be on the top layer here. So I'll make a new layer that's above everything. So for the crust, I recommend going in there and giving it kind of a dark brown outline. So I'm going to use the same fine liner pen that I did the leaves with, but a lot smaller of a size, maybe like 10%. And I'll carefully add a couple of broken outlines just along the edge there. And then I'll do another outline, but a much lighter color, and I'll do this one very, very sparingly. And for the plate, you don't have to, but you can add a very light outline to that as well. And there we go. This simple cheesecake is all done. And here's what it looks like when I print it out. So hopefully this technique here is pretty simple and pretty easy to follow. I tried to design it to be modular, so everything we discussed can be used to paint any kind of cake or dessert. Just again, keep in mind that if something doesn't look right, it might not be saturated enough, and any kind of fruit will always look better when it has a little bit of transparency and glossiness to it. And I think that's the case because it just makes everything look fresher. And lastly here, again, if you like these kind of videos, please drop a like and subscribe if you haven't already. And that pretty much wraps it up. As always, thank you so much for your support. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.